Now, South Africans continue to feel the pinch of rising costs. Just this week, motorists had to dig deeper into their pockets as the cost of petrol and diesel increased. Now, could the fuel hike mean an increase in other goods? Added to this, the Reserve Bank's decision to increase interest rates with more hikes on the cards. Let's discuss this further with Annaline van der Poel from A Debt Rescue. Annaline, as always, thank you very much for joining us on the show. And I suppose we take for granted that over the years, because of the rate of inflation and just the tough economic climate, South Africans have actually gotten poorer, and it's become that much more difficult to keep up with the cost rises. Just give us a broad sense of the implications of the latest bout of increases on our pockets.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. Yes, realistically, I mean, we have the benchmarks for inflation as set by the Reserve Bank, trying keeping it between 3 and 6, and as we know recently, it's been sitting on the higher side. But the reality, if you look at something as an individual item, for example, fuel, the petrol price went up over the 12-month period of 2021 by over 30%. Now, the significance of that on consumer pockets is really, really wide, because you are comparing not just the direct impact, which is how does it affect me in my transport costs monthly, but also indirectly, because those costs on transport get directly transferred onto the goods that we buy, because everything in South Africa is transported by road. So again, a direct and indirect impact and a knock-on effect on our pockets. So what does it mean for consumers? Well, consumers are struggling exponentially to keep up with the cost of living. We know that there is about an electricity price hike coming. It's just in our salaries increase or anything to that effect, because the economy is struggling, and especially because of the effect of the pandemic on.
No, absolutely, Annaline, and I think a consequence of all these elements that you've just mentioned to us is that a lot of South Africans have resorted to getting unsecured debt to manage their living expenses. And that, of course, is not the best route to be taking because of the high interest rates that come along with unsecured debt. Absolutely, and that's the difficulty that consumers are facing right now, because they cannot afford to pay both their debt and their living expenses, because it's just gotten so expensive to live. The small impact of maybe 20 or 30 or 40 rand that we think it is on every tank of petrol, for example, that we fill up, it has a knock-on effect on the rest of our budget, because it depends on whether you are using public transport or a private transport and your own vehicle. Irrespective, there's a direct knock-on effect, and consumers are facing situations now where they are not making to the end of the month with the funds that they have, and there's more month than money, and they're having to turn to credit at the end of the day, which is completely unsustainable, because you're buying goods that are consumed on credit, but they are left with absolutely no alternative. No, absolutely. So then what advice would you give to a struggling consumer, Annaline? It sounds like they are in a very tight corner, and there's not much one could say to encourage them to perhaps behave better, or that the situation can get better if you maybe budget better, for example.
Well, I think you said the key word there, which is budget. It's that one word we hate saying, but the reality is it really does give us a good perspective of what our circumstances are. And, I would always recommend start with a budget, set up a basic one, take a couple of months of bank statements, just so that you can see what is happening in your financial world, and split your budget up into 3 sections. Have an income section, an expense section, and a debt section. And your income expenses is obviously income you can rely on, your salary that you have, or whatever form of income, but income that you can guarantee it's going to be there. Expenses, this is your fuel, your rent, your food, etc., insurances, school fees, all the normal monthly expenses you have. And your debt is obviously your actual debt, which would be your home loans, vehicle finance, credit cards, etc. When you look at your expense section specifically, that is where there's usually some opportunity to make some changes, seeing where your trends are. And even when it comes to, for example, your transport costs, where we could do things a little bit differently, plan our trips better, so that we go out less and just work smart with, for example, that, or look for subscriptions and items you have on your expenses that you no longer use, no longer need, that you can cancel.
put some cash back into the pocket where you can.
No, absolutely. And just a final thought from you, Annaline. We usually don't know how the price of electricity is calculated, for example, by NERSA or by Eskom. And we also don't really understand all of the elements or all of the figures that go into calculating the price of petrol. How important is it for a consumer to understand and know the process?
Well, I think historically we didn't take much notice of it because it wasn't necessary, because the impact on our budget was pretty constant and stable. But seeing these exponential increases over the past year or so has left us with no alternative than to ask, how do they derive the amount that we pay every month? And I think it's a fair question for us as consumers at the end of the day to know what are we paying for and how do we get there. So I think it's obviously been raised by the AA in the last couple of months, and even the finance minister has mentioned it. So I think the reality is it's a fair question, and I think it would give us a better understanding as to how is the price derived and how does it affect me, and is there opportunities where it can be reduced, because it's incredibly high at the moment.